Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sid Orlando, editor-in-chief of Increment Magazine, here with my colleague Kate Lee, publisher of Stripe Press, and we're so pleased to welcome you to today's panel on open source.
Thanks, Sid. Today's event is part of our virtual conversation series, which brings together Increment contributors and Stripe Press authors to talk about the human things that matter in technology now and hopefully well into the future. You can learn more, see what's coming up, or watch recordings of previous conversations at stripe.events/conversations. Our panel today will be about 40 minutes of moderated conversation, followed by a short Q&A. Thanks to those of you who have sent questions along already. If you have any more, please share them with us using the Q&A function located at the bottom of the screen.
All right, so let's get to it. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, who in turn will introduce you to the excellent panelists we are honored to be joined by today. Please welcome the one and only MG, formerly known as Michael Glukowski, who'll take us through this conversation. MG builds new developer experiences here at Stripe as part of our DevRel team. He was also the co-founder of RethinkDB, an open source database for the real-time web. Thrilled to have him and his intriguing questions with us today.
Thanks so much, Sid. I'm really excited to be here. We're really lucky to have 3 speakers today for our Increment and panel, and all of them have deep roots in open source and have unique perspectives to share on today's topic, which is how open source technology is changing the world around us and what goes into supporting that ecosystem. So I'd love to introduce first Nadia Eghbal, who is a writer and researcher who explores how the internet is enabling individual creators. She's also the author of a forthcoming book on Stripe Press, Working in Public, the Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software. From 2015 to 2019, she focused on the production of open source software, working independently and at GitHub to improve the open source developer experience. Next, we have Safia Abdalla, who's a software engineer and open source maintainer on the Interact project, which is a notebook and workflow service that supports interactive programming. She enjoys bringing people together to build and do great things. Sophie Alpert is our next speaker, and she's an engineering manager at Humu. Previously, she worked at Facebook as the engineering manager for React, an open source library used by millions of developers. She's an expert in fixing software systems and really enjoys good food. And I was curious about how to size the React project. I just looked in, it looks like they've accepted contributions from nearly 1,500 people around the world, which is really impressive. So I'm excited to dive in, and thank you all for joining us today. So our first question that I have for our panelists. Open source means many things to different people. To some people, it's about the license. To others, it's about software or the community. How do you personally define open source? Nadia, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I take the strictest definition of open source, which is that it really is just a license. And the reason I sort of focus on that is because it really underlies how open source really only tells us about how we can use software, and there isn't actually that much information or vocabulary to describe how open source is actually made. And so, yeah, when I think about open source, I just think about distribution side and licenses. We have a lot of different licenses to describe different types of open source software, but if you kind of turn your brain over to the production side of things, we actually don't really have many words to describe different types of open source projects.
Safia, how do you see open source from your perspective?
Yeah, so programming has long been a hobby of mine. It's something that I started to do when I was very young and that I've been fortunate enough to pursue as a career. And so for me, open source is really a service that I give to the world. It's kind of my volunteer time on Earth because it's something that I enjoy and it's a skill set that I happen to be talented in. And open source software is the vehicle for me to share that with the world. That's how I view it.
I love that personal experience with open source. It's wonderful how people are able to carve out time in their lives to be able to help support projects, and that's sort of the thing that's been moving open source forward so much. Sophie, how do you see open source, having worked on one of the larger projects out there?
Yeah, I think open source projects can differ in a lot of ways, whether they're developed primarily by one person or 1,000, or whether they're driven more by corporations or individuals, even whether they're software or not. But at the core, my sort of philosophical take on this is open source to me is a way of sharing your work in a way that others can not just benefit from the final output of what you made, but also learn from your entire process and adapt what you've made, whether that's into a better version of the same thing or something else entirely.
Yeah, it's I remember the remix culture of like the sort of early 2000s, and it feels like a lot of open source has been has felt like it's been running parallel to the remix culture. So open source defined formally has really only been around for 22 years, like the term open source. And there's like this famous meeting that happened, I think, shortly after Netscape was released between a number of contributors to basically figure out like how do we define this thing that we're trying to identify, with its roots in like the free software and free culture movements, and they came up with the term open source. And it's pretty remarkable because it's actually a pretty short amount of time, like 22 years is not that long. And the other notable shift in the last 2 decades is that it's cheaper than ever to start a company. It used to cost about $5 million in 2000, shrinking to 5,000 in 2011, thanks to cloud services and all these companies that were built using open source. And today it's like a few $100s. And it's interesting how these are like parallel innovations that have happened. How else have you seen open source have a great and surprising impact on the world? Sophie, how about we start with you?
Sure. One thing that I think is really exciting about open source is, especially in the software space, I think that's what we're all most familiar with here is with open source, these days you're seeing that large corporations and these gigantic projects are using the exact same technology and infrastructure that is available to anyone. You see this with of course, projects like Linux, projects like the actual programming languages that you use, almost all the popular ones are open source, but also higher level software as well. You see this with like different web servers and different libraries for building things on the web and also not on the web. And for a long time, it seemed like leading tech companies had a huge amount of proprietary code. And that's still true today. Most of Facebook isn't open source, most of Stripe isn't open source, but what you do see is that the actual building blocks for those platforms, for the things that are not specific to any one business, but are relevant to like anyone building a software company, the best tools in the world that you can buy for any amount of money are usually the ones that are already open source and free, which anybody in the world can use and which anyone can adapt. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, it's that democratization. And I think we were talking earlier about like, I remember like the original like C++ compilers that you would get like on a machine like Borland and that kind of all those stacks, like you'd have to go buy them. Like you have to go buy a license to like be able to like compile code on your machine and to do it well. And now the fact that you can just like pull any distribution for any programming language and immediately get up and running is really remarkable. Nadia, how have you seen that shift communities and how have you seen the proliferation of access to these tools and its impact on the world?
Yeah, I was actually just going to build off that a little bit. And I think like one of the underappreciated aspects of open source is democratizing education for people that want to learn a new language or a new tool. Not just people who aren't familiar with software whatsoever and are learning from scratch, but also people that want to try something different on a weekend. It used to be that you'd have to, like, as we said, purchase a lot of things to get started. Not all programming tools are even freely available. I think we sort of almost take for granted that even programming languages are free. Most of them are free and accessible for anyone to learn from. So all you really need is an internet connection.
Yeah, it's the access for education. I think it works. It's gone hand in hand with like the hacker personality, where you sort of like just pick up something and start tinkering and start learning, and people sharing ideas with each other online. Safia, with Interact, you see a lot of researchers who are using open source tools increasingly. How are you seeing like the sort of the hackers and then the researchers? Like how are they starting to work together to build like new tools for progress?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting impacts of open source software is on the scientific community. And I think what we're seeing more and more of in a lot of disciplines is that every scientist is actually a data scientist and a software engineer. One of the most popular uses of Python in science is around reproducible science. Scientists are now open sourcing their data sets so that any citizen scientist has access to the same data that these scientists are working on. Open or scientists use some of the same open source tools that are available to a data scientist in a corporation or a hobbyist or anyone else. So I think this intersection of open tools, open data, and then public access research papers is proving to be a really interesting compounding effect where a lot of average people have access to the same information and the ability to understand the same concepts that these scientists are working on. I mean, I think it really contributes to the accessibility of science in our society and our ability to like disseminate and share knowledge a lot more effectively.
So, you know, we've talked about sort of the hidden world of open source, you know, in spaces where there are these like projects that are basically powering most systems we use today. I mean, Linux is a good example where like, it's interesting because most development happens like on a mailing list, right? It's like most of the communication and collaboration, which is like pretty shocking that it works as well as it does, you know, and that Linux is basically everywhere now. And you know, these sort of like infrastructure tools, like I sometimes I think about tools like curl, which like who's maintaining it? Like there are wonderful people maintaining it. We rely on it every single day. There are unsung heroes. But one of the sort of challenges as these projects have become more popular is that, you know, maintainers need to not just maintain software, but also community. What practical steps can maintainers of open source projects take that you've seen to ensure a high quality bar, an inclusive community, especially for new contributors, and have a positive flow of contributions and ideas? Nadia, you've spent a lot of time studying different open source projects. What have you seen be the most effective?
A couple things come to mind, just sort of top of mind. One being documentation, which is something that I think people forget to write things down on how they do things. This is true for all organizations, not just open source projects. I'm sure we all have that experience internally of like no one has actually written down how to do something, but especially in open source when the idea is that you're hoping that other people are able to contribute. Being able to just sort of like write down how to get started, making sure our issues are clearly labeled, writing down just like how the contribution process works can be really helpful in just making it easier for anyone to sort of stumble upon your project and be able to pitch in. I had another one I was thinking of, and now it has slipped my mind, but
we can come back if you feel free to pipe up.
Oh yeah, another thought was just like modeling the behavior that you want to see in your community. So while I was at GitHub, one of the things we did was a bunch of research on open source behaviors of people that were using GitHub, and we found that a lot of people, when they see negative behavior taking place on an open source project, it makes them just not want to contribute at all. And so if someone does something that's sort of like hostile or unpleasant, it's important to say something publicly if you're the maintainer of a project, and just set the tone of the way that people talk to each other and the way that you want to see people talk to each other, because it's not just about punishing that one person or sanctioning them or whatever, but it's really just about all the invisible people that you might not realize how many people are actually watching that interaction and taking from it what is or isn't going to happen.
I remember when we were running Rethink to be, one of the more shocking things that I read in Hacker News was that people would come in and say, like, yeah, the first thing I do every morning is I make my coffee and then I check GitHub Hacker News and then like the Rethink to be repository to see like how they were building it in the open, because they were just so fascinated to see all those threads. You know, and like, it's funny because GitHub is shipping off all their code to, I think, the North Pole, right? It's to go archive it. And when you think about the unseen watchers, like, it's not just the code, it's like all of the conversations that are actually, you know, recorded somewhere, like for posterity. People will be looking at how software was built, and, you know, it weighs upon us to behave well. Sophie, I mean, you've obviously, you know, such a large project with so many users. I mean, how do you see this unfold at scale?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have to second what Nadia said about just setting a good example whenever you can. And that's not just on GitHub, which is oftentimes what you think of, but like a lot of projects, including React, have a huge community on Twitter where there's tens or hundreds of thousands of people on Twitter who are, you know, excited about the project. And, you know, like one concrete thing we try to do is whenever we see somebody calling out another like React competitor, quote unquote, and saying like, oh, that one sucks, React is way better. Whenever we see that, we do try to step in and just say like, no, that's not what we're here about. You know, we want this to be a very collaborative space. Other projects are great. They have different ideas. But that's great. Like we don't want there to be a single project that everybody uses. We'd rather have a little bit of competition and building off of ideas from one another. And so we try to set that example whenever we can. In terms of more concrete things you can do to facilitate contribution, one thing we did on the project, which many popular projects do, is tag certain issues with a label that just says good first issue. Which means, you know, if you're new to open source, if you're new to this project, but you're interested in contributing, here is an issue that you could take a look at and see. And so it's usually a relatively low learning curve, and then a way that you can provide some value without having a ton of context beforehand. And we found sort of a counterintuitive thing, which is our first instinct when we were using this label was to put it on issues that were interesting to us. And so we hoped they would also be interesting to somebody else. But what we realized over time is that the main core of React was actually pretty complex and hard to get into. And so those didn't come up that much. And then what we found over time, really through a little bit of trial and error, is that tasks that we would think on the core team were not that interesting, and maybe a little bit of grunt work, or maybe it's something you know, on our build system to help us move faster when we're developing it, but is like slightly ancillary to the actual product we ship out. Those usually get a little less focus from the core team. And what we did was we found that those actually make great first issues. And the reason is that even if it feels a little bit menial to us as project contributors, usually a new collaborator will learn a ton just by going through that issue. And it won't feel like grunt work to them, and they'll actually enjoy it and learn it a lot. And then it's also something off our plates. And so we had a lot of success with that.
I've definitely noticed that some open source projects have had great success by just like putting up a clarion call for like, we need modules for every single framework, like just go build, and then people will go off and build. And that seems to be a pretty effective model at scale. Safia, researchers have different collaboration models, like PhDs have academic collaboration is different than open source collaboration. How have you seen those two worlds mesh? And how have you found like cases where researchers have done really novel things for the open source community coming from their approach that's been really productive?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about open science and open source software in academia is that a lot of the scientists that I interact with are actually open source developers. And there's kind of this really interesting pathway wherein someone will start from academia, produce some sort of software that is useful for academics and researchers, and then that software gains some wide appeal, and now they're an open source developer. And I think what's interesting about that is that you see a lot of the same interactions that would happen in academia come to fruition in open source, and some of kind of the same contracts that exist in academia with regards to grants and very university focused open source efforts happening in open source as well. So that fusion of models is kind of interesting. I do think at the moment it really only happens in open source projects that have a very strong academic audience. For me, I'm thinking specifically about scientific computing tools in Python, Julia R, some of those technologies that end up being used a lot in statistics and physics labs and elsewhere in academia. So that's where I kind of see those intersections happening. I did want to add to the conversation around making open source more accessible to contributors, and add that there's this like other dimension, which is not just making it more accessible to first-time contributors, but providing a pathway to maintainership. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that maintainers do hold a lot of power in open source projects. And one of the things that we've been very intentional about in the Interact project is making sure that there's a very strong model to becoming a maintainer. And one of the ways that we do that is like very simple and explicit. It's inspired by another contributor model called C4, which is the Collective Code Construction Contract, I believe is the abbreviation. The idea is that the moment somebody makes a contribution to the project, they're invited to be a maintainer. There's no sense of, having to spend years working on something before you're accredited or named a maintainer. There's no kind of exclusivity or barriers to entry for that. And I think that really contributes to a more inclusive set of maintainers on projects. Generally, the people who are maintainers of open source projects mimic the same demographics that you would see in the tech industry to an even worse degree. And then it also makes it easier for people to lean into a project when they see that, hey, you've made the effort to be a part of it. Now you have just as much ability to triage and review and work on issues as any other maintainer. So I think those kinds of concepts are really important to hone in on as well.
I'm really glad that you brought up the experience of being a maintainer and how it's really a double-edged sword, right? Because like on the one hand, like there is inherent power that is built from being a maintainer and leading a community. And we've seen different models for how people structure their communities. You can think of like the benevolent dictator for life model, which is popular to open source projects. I don't know what that says ultimately about the nature of open source today. That seems to be like one of the more effective models sometimes. But also that like, it is hard to be a maintainer because, you do need a lot of support. And part of that is also that structurally, we don't really have good financial models that support open source. And that naturally means that people who have more privilege and more ability to be able to independently write code and not have to worry about day to day, naturally are more likely to also be maintainers. Since I've started at open source, I mean, it's been a conversation around systemic funding challenges. What's been really exciting to see has been the emergence of infrastructure like GitHub sponsors or Open Collective, where money movement is now easier than ever. And it enables users to directly fund the work of open source maintainers. And we're seeing all these different like ways of structuring your donation, where sometimes it's like a consultant who will say, oh, you can get hours with me, right, to be able to work on this project, and you'll get first class support on issues, to just like, Patreon and Kickstarter style, like support me, like get a t-shirt, like feel like you're supporting great work. But I do have to ask, I mean, having been a maintainer myself, all of you have been in the thick of it. Is this enough to support maintainers? Like, what else do maintainers need to feel happy and fulfilled and capable of doing great work? Sophie, how about we start with you with your experience in the corporate open source world?
Yeah, I mean, React is, like you said, it's corporate open source. Almost everybody who has commit access works at Facebook, and it's a pretty different model from what Safia was just describing, where like anybody who makes a valuable contribution is awarded the maintainer ability. I think that for React, we've felt that works well for the most part, and the reason for that is that React is the core of React is a very complicated piece of software that we try to put it in we try to put it in a shell or like an API that seems very simple, or as simple as we can make it, but there is a lot going on internally, versus I think a lot of other projects have hundreds or thousands of separate APIs where it's a lot easier to develop on one piece of it without necessarily needing to understand the rest or affecting the rest of the project. And on React, we found that wasn't the case as much, that you need a huge amount of context to be able to contribute productively. And we found that like even conversations about project direction and what a new feature should be are way more seem to be way more productive when the people working on it have that huge amount of context from basically from working full time on it already. And now, it's totally true that means that, it is a smaller group and it's harder for other opinions to be heard sometimes. And so it's definitely not for everyone. I think that overall, it's worked fairly well for the React team, although I know that they're also interested in trying to bring in more non-Facebook contributors, although still will likely be people who spend a lot of time working on React and can keep up with like all of the different ideas and discussions that we have, because there tends to be a lot of overlap. Plus, you can always fork it if you want.
That is always a possibility. Go fork it. Safia, how have you seen, people collaborating when they step up to be a maintainer, like beyond the contract that you mentioned, which is really interesting. I love the idea of like a conscious covenant where you're really saying like, look, these are the things I'm agreeing to do. What are the other needs of these people beyond funding? Because obviously, like, we always assume academia funding is the big question, as you mentioned, and new models are emerging, but like, what are the other needs?
Yeah. So the Interact project is in a bit of a different position. It's actually, Interact is an organization. We have a couple of different projects under our wing. And Interact is a 501c3. We're physically sponsored by a nonprofit called NumFocus, but we do operate as a nonprofit organization. One of the things that we end up needing a lot of help with are actually, I would say, there's kind of 4 vectors. There's legal support, there's infrastructure support, there's funding support, and then there's leadership support. So legal support is really basic things like, maybe we want to hire an independent contractor to do a piece of work on one of our open source projects that maintainers or nobody else has capacity or expertise on. That's a scenario where we need help with, getting the contracts out, getting the person paid, all of that fun stuff that, a company or a private entity might have the infrastructure for, but an open source project that's physically sponsored won't necessarily have the same. Then infrastructure support, I think this comes in the form of like free hosting or like open or cloud credits that a lot of companies will provide. But I think there's an element to it that's also getting help with the ops side of open source projects. So making sure that we have like GitHub actions that are testing the right things, making sure that our GitHub bots are configured correctly, that we've got the right permissions on stuff so that it's secure. There's a lot of like little details that as a maintainer you have to square away to make sure that the community is healthy and secure, but you really don't have time on. Financial support, I think, is the thing that ends up being discussed the most often with open source projects. You mentioned Open Collective and Patreon and other kind of donation-based models where it's an individual giving money to another individual or an entity. For Interact, one of the models that we end up relying on the most is actually grants for open source work. Those are super effective for our project because typically we want to dedicate a certain amount of time and money to a piece of focused effort. And we find that grants are a great way to A, make sure that we have funding for that effort, and B, make sure that we have follow through with our community when we pull out or push out a grant impact report that says, hey, this is the money, this is what we did with it, and this is the results for the community. And then leadership support, I think, is super undervalued because, like 5 years ago, I was just a schmuck who started coding. And now there's this entire project under my wing, and I have responsibility to a lot of things, and I am a leader to people. And I've never been trained in that. And a lot of open source maintainers have not been trained to be leaders. And so that's a key gap to fill, is leadership training, the ability to say, hey, you do have this power as the maintainer of this project that is so key to open source or to software infrastructure across the world. Like, this is how you effectively use that power. So I think that's kind of where things differ when an open source project is not corporate sponsored open source, and it's just kind of out in the open, nonprofit backed, or maybe doesn't even have legal nonprofit status. It's just out in the open.
Yeah, it takes a surprising amount of machinery to get like things that you think are obvious and easy done. And it turns out that your list just keeps growing as more people join and needs keep evolving.
Yeah.
Nadia, what have you noticed when you've been studying like the most effective projects and of all different shapes and sizes? Like, what are the levers and tools that have been provided to encourage a good experience for maintainers and holistically, like what is goes into making like a really long-term viable, sustainable project?
I think that's a hard question.
Yeah.
Like asking what makes a good company. There are a lot of different answers. I think like just roughly how I start to sort of divide up that question is thinking about the type of project that it is. I'm really interested in sort of like classifying some of the taxonomy of different types of projects that we see in open source. And so if you are a single maintainer on a project and you have a lot of demand, that's just sort of like placed on you personally. That's a very different sort of way of thinking about the project versus a project that might have a foundation attached to it, or most of the maintainers do work at the same company. And so I think like, if you're a project that has to deal with a lot of different maintainers or very active contributors, there are a lot of just more complex governance challenges around the projects that I see that are successful are the ones that are addressing those governance challenges head on, of just how to manage contributions, how to bring in new maintainers, or pass on succession. Whereas if you're a single maintainer, your needs might be a little bit more acute, I guess, where you're mostly just interested in how do I reduce the volume of interactions because it's just sort of like me and there might not be anyone else coming. And so they might be experiencing one-off interactions with a lot of casual contributors, but be a solo maintainer on a project. And so in those situations, setting up just tools and systems, automation, issue templates, pull request templates, just sort of making it very easy to review and accept or close out contributions that they're like reviewing is a very different sort of mindset. Although I do think those sorts of issues affect all sorts of projects. And maybe that is like one of the commonalities is there's always work that humans need to do. And then there's also work that you can rely on tools to use, and developers really love making tools for themselves. And so there's no shortage of help out there. And so I think instead of trying to do everything yourself and being able to rely on all the other good knowledge from other projects to automate or reduce your work is really helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting how many open source projects are like built on the building blocks of past open source projects, and how like each burgeoning individual cell is like building up into a greater whole. And it's just way easier to run a project now than it was 10 years ago. And like, returning to what we were saying before, we had an audience question around, we talked about how so many more people are learning to program now than ever. And it's weird to think that we're still early in the cycle of open source, and to see this sort of revolution happen in slow form is really exciting. What structural shifts are you all noticing now that we should expect to impact open source over the next like 5-10 years, and going further? Like, what are the things that you're really seeing that are most exciting? Nadia, let's start with you.
The biggest structural shift that I've seen in just sort of like surveying the land from 20 years ago to now is the emergence of these projects that are single maintainer or few maintainer that really challenge these historical notions that we have around what it means to contribute, because they might not be able to benefit from a community of contributors. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Like, I think in some cases, it is just a matter of making the project easier to contribute to. In other cases, it's because the project itself is so small in scope, or there just aren't that many people that know that technology, that it just makes it really difficult to think about this. All the sort of best practices that we do have around encouraging new contributors are being challenged by this feeling of, well, I'm just sort of doing this alone. And so like one of the arguments that I make in the book that I recently published is that we can compare that sort of situation to the experience of being a creator on any other platform, a single creator on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. And that experience of sort of being like alone and facing an audience just prompts a different set of questions about how to manage your open source project versus a project that benefits from having a wider community of contributors.
Safia, what are you seeing structurally change in institutions that used to be through more like top-down funding and structures? Like what are you seeing that is structurally changing in the worlds you interact with?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two interesting elements. There's the element where, so it's interesting as I kind of live in two worlds because I work at Microsoft, and as part of my day job at Microsoft, I contribute to an open source project that's corporate sponsored.
Those are very different. Yeah.
At night,
yeah.
continue to do open source, but in this completely different capacity where I work on Interact. It's not really maintained by a single company. It's just a group of individuals. We happen to have this 501c3 status. And I think one of the most interesting things is kind of the intersection between the two of how companies are starting to get involved with open source projects and some of the intersections that we see around what ideas open source has to adopt in order to be more friendly or consumable to companies. One thing that comes to mind is just the notion of like having roadmaps and deadlines and commitments to ship things by a particular date. This is one of the first things that tend to come up when we talk about adopting Interact at a company or Interact in any kind of private organization is like, when is this going to ship? And that's just not a question that I ever have to encounter when this is just a community. So I think this kind of like melding of open source in what is essentially a capitalist society that requires things to be delivered by certain times to provide value to certain people, how those two kind of things clash. I'm not sure that there's a resolution to that yet in some of the conversations that I'm in. I think that's an idea that's still evolving. I'm sure Nadia might have some interesting insights to share on that, but there's kind of this merger of how things are done in corporate for-profit spaces and how things are done in open source spaces, and how when the two need to work together, what kind of concessions need to be made and how do each entities change to accommodate those requests, and whether that's a good or bad thing or just a necessary aspect.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because, you know, even though open source feels fresh and new in its collaboration model, it turns out that building software is a pretty universally hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And I'm like put in mind of I think like the original like NASA program to build like software for the original Apollo program. Like they wrote this amazing report at the end. They were like, look, like, you know, software and complexity requires a high degree of collaboration between people, and it's really complex and will require advanced tools to figure this out. And I think like people keep like relearning this lesson over and over. And you're right, like the traditional tools of like, you know, building software in a company seem to apply to a community, even though they do need to be tailored and rethought. Sophie, how have you seen like internal Facebook like tools approach towards, you know, building software translate to when it sort of meets with the reality of like a lot of people who you don't know on the internet?
Yeah, you know, I think that Facebook is a company that has always had a big focus on like internal tools and trying to make its own developers more efficient and its own employees of all types. I think that when you look at a project like React or many others, you know, it's reflective of a little bit of a shift in the industry where previously most large open source projects were independently run. Like, you know, you have like the Linux project, which has a lot of corporate contributors, like or even companies that spend a huge amount of time contributing, like Red Hat and Intel have always been big contributors to the Linux kernel. But more recently, in addition to the proliferation of independent projects that Nadia mentioned, you also see a lot more corporate projects that are built and created and maintained by a single company or primarily by a single company. And in fact, most of the I'll say trendiest open source projects today do fall into that category. And I think it's a little bit, you know, I think it's definitely a bit of a shift. And I think it's too early to say how that's going to pan out. Like maybe 10 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say, wow, like so many corporations abandoned these projects and like it turned out to be a really bad idea to build on top of them. You know, hopefully that doesn't happen, but it totally could. You know, I think the reason, or like most of these projects have come about because they are examples of these tools that companies have built for themselves. I mean, at least you do have some projects that are a company trying to build a platform to attract people to their company or their company's services, things like that. But there's many others, including React, that are a tool that was built at a company to help that company's own employees. And then people looked at it and said, wow, this is actually really helpful, or we found it helpful, so let's share it with the world and let other people get value out of it. And that goes back to what I said at the very beginning of, the best tools in the industry being available to anyone in the world in many cases. And I think that just continues to be true, and is really exciting to me.
Yeah, that's definitely been a significant shift, is seeing all these companies embrace like taking their internal tools and sharing it with the world. And it's exciting to see these building blocks continue to be released, and we'll see like how they all fit together over time. We've talked about unsung heroes. I'd like to take a moment because unfortunately we're almost out of time, which I could talk to you about. I have so many more questions. We could talk all day, but if you were to name one project that you really just want to celebrate, that you think is underappreciated, or represents something really novel that people should take a look at, who would you recommend that folks follow up with after this panel? Nadia, who are you most excited by?
Oh, I wanted to highlight a person who's one small part of a much bigger project, but someone that I've just sort of viewed as a really great shining example in open source, Brett Cannon, who's a core developer on the Python programming language. Just sort of like models, I think he's done a really great job of not only being thoughtful and sharing out a lot of his learnings on his blog, but has a lot of the really great welcoming things that the Python community is known for. He's been a big part in driving that.
Safia, who are you seeing that you're really excited by?
Yeah, I wanted to shout out a project/community. The project is Matplotlib. It's a Python package for static and interactive data visualizations. It's used a ton all across the world of science. One of the most popular scenarios is actually by the Space Telescope Institute, I think, which is in charge of the Hubble telescope. So a lot of how we are understanding the universe and understanding ourselves is powered by this open source tool. So I think it's key for its impact on society in that way. I also think the community is really great. They go out of their way to be exclusive and to expand the ecosystem of contributors to underrepresented individuals in the industry. And they're very intent about how they manage their code of conduct and their community, and recognize really interesting use cases of Matplotlib. So giving them a shout out.
I've used it and it's a great library.
Nice.
Sophie, how about you? Who's in your mind?
Yeah. One project I've been excited about recently is a small project by Tatiana Mack called Self-Defined, which you can find at selfdefined.app. It's an online dictionary focused on definitions of words someone might identify as, or words related to identity. And as the site says, if you visit it, quote, words can provide us with a sense of identity and allow us to find kinship through common experiences. And I love it because you can use it to understand the social history of the word, when it is and isn't appropriate to use. And the definitions are, in most cases, written by the community. So they're able to focus on how a word is seen by the people whom that word most affects. So
I love that open sourcing of definitions. That's wonderful. Yeah. So I'll hand it off to Sid to wrap up today's panel, but I just want to thank everyone for your time. It's been so wonderful to talk about open source with you all.
thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap. That was amazing. I learned a million things, as usual. To our wonderful attendees, if you would, please do take the survey that immediately follows this session. These conversations are for you, and we'd really love to know what you liked, what you want more of, what you want to hear a conversation about next. Nadia, Sophie, Safia, MG, thank you for sharing your insights, your ideas. We appreciate you and everything that you shared. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great day.